and I know lots of people who work in the field of mental health. And they tell me, a lot of the people that come in that I see, they have in their lives all sorts of different things going on that at their root are often caused by black and white thinking about gray areas in life, about jobs, about relationships, about their childhood, whatever. And I believe that the same is happening in politics and specifically with the Bolivia situation. So let's try to put that aside. Let's just all talk like reasonable people. No one's shilling here. Some people may.
My name is David Attenborough, or Prince Charles, or I don't know, you. Today we observe in its natural habitat the rare and exotic golden-bellied liberal. Once seen as an honest and passive creature, these tempestuous times have forced this now endangered species to adopt new methods of survival. These include fetishizing civility, strange musings about issues on both sides, and occasionally setting their own pants on fire. When a liberal is about to lie to you, they will often begin this ritual with a warning prelude, which in the case of this particular beta cuck soy boy involves using the first quarter of an 8-minute video to patronize you and talk about nuance. There is a coup happening in Bolivia, one which seems strikingly similar to so many others that have occurred in the region over the past several decades. When we're dealing with a small country that most people know very little about, it becomes important to identify patterns, and to understand these events as part of a broader story that relates it to neighbouring countries and to the rest of the world. And though it might be tempting to stress over the details over whether or not this meets the technical definition of a coup, more on that later, I'm mostly going to focus on the underlying economic and geopolitical forces that make this such a recurring theme in Latin America. Spoiler alert, el problema es el capitalismo. So, Bolivia. Just like the rest of South America, the story begins with colonialism. In 1538, the Incas and other indigenous groups in Bolivia were defeated by Spanish settlers. They had been so weakened by the diseases brought over by the Spaniards that the area was conquered by an army of less than 200 people. For the next 3 centuries, the Spaniards were allowed to enjoy Bolivia's rich supply of silver and minerals at the expense of the enslaved indigenous population. As their wealth grew, so too did the rift between the 36 native Bolivian ethnic groups and the light-skinned European upper class who would continue to rule Bolivia until the 21st century. If you've ever wondered why Latin American leaders tend to look a little whiter than the average population, this is why. After the abolition of slavery, there was little done to close this disparity. A large part of Bolivia's varied terrain includes the Andes Mountains and the Amazon Basin, which are primarily inhabited by the indigenous Quechua, Aymara, and Afro-Bolivians. Much of this region is very high and rugged, and because it was only native people living there, the Spanish did very little to develop the area. Until quite recently, Bolivia was the poorest country in South America. In 1809, the Venezuelan freedom fighter Simón Bolívar led a guerrilla force in a 16-year war against the Spanish royalists. When the royalists were defeated, this small country, which had previously been known as Upper Peru, took on the name of the revolutionary leader, and Bolivian independence was declared in 1825. But the inequalities produced by 3 centuries of Spanish rule remained, and the following century was made up of bitter conflict between the indigenous peasant and miner movements and right-wing movements such as the military dictator Hugo Banzer, who ruled in the 1970s with financial and advisory assistance from the Nixon administration. Banzer would later become famous for his underground horror chambers, where over 8,000 of his political opponents were tortured, and at least 155 disappeared. Survivors stated that electronic shocks were applied with a cattle prod to their genitals and teeth, whereas others had needles pushed under their fingernails, or were placed into a flooded cell and then electrocuted. But why would an American president support such a brutal regime? I'm so glad you asked. It's for the same reason they support all the other ones, and that reason is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is an economic philosophy that stresses the importance of free markets and personal responsibility. It was popularized in the 1980s by the economists Friedrich von Hayek and the monopoly guy himself, Milton Friedman. It was then spearheaded by world leaders such as Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. The idea was that capitalism worked best when it was free of restrictions such as taxes and labor unions, and they set out to achieve this with policies of deregulation, privatization, and international free trade deals. Since its inception, neoliberalism has been criticized for being less of a prescription to benefit humanity and more a means of consolidating wealth and power among the rich. As they set out to remove the red tape for big business, neoliberal governments around the world presided over the flattening of real wages, the degradation of public services, and the systematic dismantling of the welfare state, whilst giving increased government subsidies and tax breaks to corporations. Over the last 4 decades, the architects of neoliberalism have been associated with some strikingly illiberal practices. One of them being a budget implemented by the British Conservative Party in 1981, which deliberately increased unemployment in order to decrease the bargaining power of trade unions. Fucking awesome. But what does any of this have to do with Bolivia? It goes like this. Capitalists need their businesses to grow. If neoliberalism was to successfully free up capital flows in Europe and America, it would also need to ensure its access to wealth and resources around the world. This was done with the IMF. The IMF, or International Monetary Fund, is an organization centered in the US and includes almost every country on Earth. According to themselves, their role is to facilitate international trade, grow economies, secure financial stability, and reduce poverty around the world. They're mostly well known for providing loans to developing countries, Bolivia, for example. The problem is the IMF is funded by quota subscriptions paid by member states, and the bigger the donor, the more influence they have on where these loans should go, and more importantly, what the conditions of these loans should be. And the rules of the IMF are not as simple as taking a loan and repaying it with interest. In order to be eligible for an IMF loan, the government of a nation has to implement structural adjustment programs. Some of these include cutting wages, reduction of government spending, privatization of state-owned assets, raising the price of public services, and enhancing the rights of foreign investors. Bolivia had their big structural adjustment program from the mid-1980s to the early 2000s. As is often the case, the people on the receiving end of the IMF did not like it. Because over 2/3 of Bolivia's population is indigenous, the highest proportion on the continent, it was inevitable that the presidents who implemented neoliberal policy would have to deal with opposition from a large section of the population. One of the most famous of these rebellions became known as the Water Wars in the year 2000, where anti-neoliberal protesters in Cochabamba pushed a U-turn on water privatization and even forced 2 international corporations, Bechtel and Suez, out of the city. But the true power of Bolivia's indigenous population was made especially evident in the city of El Alto, a very new city which was incorporated in 1988 and made up almost exclusively of indigenous groups who were directly hit by IMF policy. This included peasants who were displaced by commercialization of agriculture, displaced industrial workers from privatized and closed tin mines, and low-income migrants pushed out of neighboring towns due to increased housing costs. The layout of El Alto put its citizens in a unique position, where they were actually able to choke the supply routes between themselves and the more affluent city of La Paz. The way they organized this was actually pretty amazing, and you can find a more detailed account of the events from a book called Rebel Cities, which I've linked in the description. It was the movements in La Paz that ultimately forced the resignation of 2 neoliberal presidents between 2003 and 2005, paving the way for the election of the man who stands at the center of this story, a son of llama herders and ex-coca farmer, Evo Morales. Morales, who came to power with over half of the national vote in December 2005, was Bolivia's first ever indigenous president, and one who marked a turn away from neoliberal policy. His generous social programs, funded by the partial nationalization of oil and gas, took poverty rates down from 59% to 35%, and Bolivia, though still South America's poorest country, became the fastest growing for over a decade. Official status was given to every indigenous ethnic group. It was ensured that half of the National Assembly were women, and in keeping with a popular Andean idea, the rights of Mother Earth were enshrined into the Bolivian constitution. He was the first world leader to give nature the same rights as humans, which in practice meant preserving nature's right to maintain and regenerate its vital cycles, the right to pure water and clean air, and the right to not be affected by developmental projects that affect the balance of ecosystems and local inhabitant communities. As the law stated, she is sacred, fertile, and the source of life that feeds and cares for all living beings in her womb. She is in permanent balance, harmony, and communication with the cosmos. She is comprised of all ecosystems and living things, and their self-organization. And this was in 2010. But Morales didn't come without criticism. Though it isn't easy to find a consistent overall impression of his presidency, The most common critique I could find was that many of his revolutionary promises of 2005 were abandoned or watered down to accommodate outside imperial pressures. Jeffrey Weber, who studied events in Bolivia for over 10 years, goes as far as to describe Morales' regime as reconstituted neoliberalism with Andean characteristics. Other accounts talk of his unhealthy love for vanity projects, including a luxury presidential apartment at the top of a skyscraper complete with a helipad in the middle of La Paz. In keeping up with his big boy ego, critics within his movement have highlighted that little work was done to prepare a potential successor within his party. He would also later loosen environmental protections, and once came under fire for building a highway through a protected indigenous reserve. All the same, Morales remained president of Bolivia for 14 years, winning his 2009 and 2014 elections with greater majorities than his first. Not bad for a country riddled with a history of forced resignations, putches, and assassinations. The problem this year was, Bolivia has a term limit, which states that presidents can serve a maximum of 3 terms. And Big Dick Morales wanted to run for a 4th. So he put the motion to a referendum, which the people rejected, 51% to 49%. But this is where it gets a little messy. Shortly after, the Bolivian Supreme Tribunal, their equivalent of the Supreme Court, stated that the fixed-term policy clashed with the Bolivian Constitution, which stated that every Bolivian citizen had the right to run for president. An election was then held, which Morales won with 47% of the vote. The Supreme Tribunal found no issue with the legitimacy of this election, but one group did. The Organization of American States, or OAS, published a report saying there had been data manipulation in the vote. This would become the central talking point of the entire US media, even after the OAS report was criticized by the Center of Economic Policy Research, who argued that there was no evidence of irregularities or fraud affecting the results. Fortunately, as a Brit, I've grown savvy to this kind of behaviour. Earlier this year, during the Venezuelan coup, a British Conservative MP called Jeremy Hunt tried to discredit the election of their socialist leader Nicolas Maduro by saying that ballot boxes had been stuffed. The only problem was Venezuelan elections were conducted electronically and ballot boxes hadn't been used in over a decade. As for the OAS, here's a breakdown of how the vote worked. Voting in Bolivia is mandatory for everyone aged between 18 and 70. Because turnouts are so high, presidential candidates need at least a 50% majority or a 10-point lead over the runner-up. Morales only won 47% of the vote, but this put him more than 10 points ahead of the former president Carlos Mesa, who won 36. This count was taken from the final vote, the one which legally decides whether someone becomes president or if the election has to go to a second round. But before the final count is announced, a quick count is made. Now, the quick count is simply a formality. It's made when about 80% of the votes are gathered, and its entire purpose is to just give the media a projection, something to talk about. The big complaint by the OAS was that the quick count projected Morales as well below the 10-point margin, and there was apparently no way the remaining votes could have pushed him over. But this issue is actually very easily explained by geography. What? Remember that bit about the Andes and the Amazon basin? Because of the height and rugged landscape of these areas, votes cast here are always the last to arrive, and historically, because they are predominantly indigenous, largely favoured Morales, and were expected to widen the gap projected in the quick count. That's it. The OAS have since refused to answer any questions from journalists about this report, which they had put out before the vote count had even finished. But why would the OAS want to mislead people about this? Who are they anyway? Oh, they were formed during the Cold War with the explicit intent of opposing leftism. Right, now for the exciting stuff. Though he was dismissive of the OAS's findings, Morales offered to hold a new election, with a new electoral tribunal to oversee the process. The opposition declined. Morales started to lose support from crucial allies, and several ministers resigned after their homes were targeted by rioters and kidnappers. Amid several days of disorder, the heads of the Bolivian army and police suggested that Morales step down. Minutes later, Morales boarded his presidential plane and left the capital. In the same day, he resigned and described the situation as a coup. At the time of writing, he appears to be seeking asylum in Mexico. At first glance, you can see here why some would hesitate to call this a coup. At least, it seems very underwhelming compared to coups that happen in places like Chile and Argentina. But it might be more revealing to look at the coup as more of a process than an individual event. Firstly, attempts to force Morales from office are nothing new. In 2007, a right-wing counter-revolutionary movement tried and failed to remove Morales, despite his electoral legitimacy being fully accepted by the UN. In 2008, a coup was attempted in eastern Bolivia, and it was backed by a group called the United States Agency for International Development. Love that for a name. The events following Morales' resignation have been even more telling. On November 10th, the head of Bolivia's Senate, a lawyer and ex-television presenter, Janine Áñez, declared herself interim president. To the applause of top military leaders and senators, the religious conservative unveiled her indigenous-free cabinet whilst holding a big fuck-off Bible at a late-night ceremony in the presidential palace. If that wasn't enough to unnerve Bolivia's indigenous population, she also once tweeted, "I dream with a Bolivia free of indigenous satanic rites. The city isn't for Indians, who should go back to the mountains or the fields." And the security forces, who insisted Morales' resignation was in order to keep the peace, have now been opening fire on Morales supporters, leaving at least 23 dead. If the resignation itself didn't look like a coup, or maybe did look like a coup but perhaps a not so bad kind of coup, the events leading up to and following the resignation are little other than a big old fucking coup. Unless, of course, Mr. Pac-Man, there is some nuance behind security forces backing the lady with the giant Bible who tweets about Satan and has never won an election. Go on, explain it to me, Daddy.
But for me, the real story is actually bigger than this. And I want to ask you this hypothetical. If Donald Trump, during his second term, imagine he gets reelected in November and he gets a second term. Imagine that during that second term, Donald Trump changed the Constitution to allow a third term effective immediately, but then also claimed that since the Constitution was changed, his second term is sort of really his first term under the new Constitution, so he should actually get 2 more. And then during the third term, which is really his fourth, he loses a referendum to allow unlimited terms, and then his Supreme Court justices that he has selected say, forget about the term limits, you can stay as long as you want.
Only Morales, unlike Trump, has not and is not able to appoint members of the Supreme Tribunal. Tribunal members are elected by the people in non-partisan elections for 6-year terms which are non-renewable. And if you'd taken 20 seconds to look that up instead of rambling about the idea of nuance, you might have managed to construct a case that actually was nuanced. This is a coup, and it is entirely in keeping with the behaviour of a system that can't handle it when a small country decides to nationalise its resources. The desire to remove Morales has existed for a long time, and in keeping with Naomi Klein's theory in her book The Shock Doctrine, sometimes the best way to remove a left-wing government is to do nothing. Regardless of what happened in the 2019 election, Morales' position wasn't as strong as it had been, and this was all his opponents needed. The indigenous people of Bolivia are now in fear for their very existence, and they seem to have very few friends in the international community. And all the while, the mainstream media continues to muddy the waters, whether by pedantically deliberating over whether or not this is a coup, or by just flat-out lying.
He barely wins in 2014.
Gee, David, a 2/3 majority counts as barely winning to you? And this coming from a country where you can become president even if your opponent gets more votes than you? What the f***? I suppose events like this can reveal just how embedded neoliberalism remains in the public consciousness. How decades of anti-left propaganda can rear its ugly head and still occasionally make total clowns out of otherwise decent and intelligent progressive people. To the point that this is really the best that liberal YouTube has to offer on the topic. I mean, we could always ask...
I consider platforming somebody that is a lefty to talk about historical things to be on the same level of platforming like Nick Fuentes to talk about the Holocaust.
Grumble, grumble, grumble. Unfortunately, only time will tell how far the new regime in Bolivia will go. There is sadly nothing untoward about Latin American interim governments descending into a full fascist nightmare, where thousands die and the nation's wealth is consolidated into the hands of a local elite and foreign investors, while the rest suffer as they must. What will become of Bolivia's national resources, in particular their huge untapped supply of lithium, remains to be seen. But as always, kids, the lesson remains the same. Socialism works, in theory, But in practice, you get whacked on the head by an enormous... I can't get over how big that fucking Bible is. Is that the big print version?